And welcome. Today is April 28th, 2019. This is my capstone presentation on protecting critical infrastructure using internal controls, and it's being presented to the Information Technology College faculty of Western Governors University in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the Master of Science in Cybersecurity and Information Assurance. My name is Ruben Robles. I'm a professionally registered electrical engineer. I've been in the utility industry and in the IT/OT space for 16 years, installing optical and IP networks for SCADA and relay systems during that time. For the last 3 years, I've been leading a team implementing and developing physical and cybersecurity controls for NERC-CIP, but I was recently transferred to lead my utilities network operations center. During my time working with NERC-CIP, I realized the power and simple elegance of internal controls and what they could do not only for compliance, but for security and efficiency. The reason I chose to perform my project on internal controls is because they're very cost effective. They improve efficiency, they're scalable, and unlike technological controls, they don't introduce vulnerabilities since they focus on processes. Internal controls are able to lower risk with minimal capital or operational expenditures because they're primarily process-driven and don't necessarily rely on hardware or software. Internal controls improve the efficiency and ensure the effectiveness of the processes used for security controls by either preventing or detecting any issues before they happen, or detecting or correcting issues while they're happening. Lastly, internal controls are scalable because they focus on mitigating the overall risk rather than addressing individual vulnerabilities or threats. The utility industry is facing a lot of challenges in today's environment, one of the largest being compliance with NERC Critical Infrastructure Protection Standards, or CIP for short. Failure to comply with those standards can result in fines of up to $1 million per violation per day, and unfortunately those standards continue to grow in number and change in complexity and technicality. Additionally, noncompliance can mean that a vulnerability has been created or left exposed. In the very best case scenario, a failure to comply can mean many man-hours lost in order to investigate, remediate, and mitigate the situation, even if there wasn't a penalty assigned. Typically, a non-compliance situation is rarely due to a failure within a system or a piece of equipment. On the contrary, it's usually due to a human error or human performance issue, when someone forgets to execute a step in a procedure or complete a step in order to add a needed functionality. This is because the human factor is the largest variable we deal with on a daily basis. Issues in human performance can arise due to fatigue from too much work, stress at home, or from other sources, probably a lapse in judgment due to an assumption they may have made, or because there is just so much coordination that has to happen to make sure a job is done appropriately. But one of the biggest reasons is because the skills needed to perform much of the work on sensitive systems within utilities is increasing, so much so that they just can't keep up. So they rely on processes and procedures which may be either outdated, may be too detailed to be flexible, or maybe too high level to deal appropriately with the specific situation in hand. So the project consisted of identifying and defining internal controls in order to treat the risk of exposed vulnerabilities in a non-compliant situation within a fictitious utility I called Tesla Consolidated Power, or TCP for short. So TCP owns and operates critical infrastructure on the bulk electric system in the desert southwest, which are categorized within the CIP standards as low bulk electric system cyber systems. This is also known as low impact BCS. In the context of compliance, the NERC-CIP with the NERC-CIP standards, an internal control is any mechanism which prevents, detects, or corrects an issue within a security control. To begin the project, I started in the planning phase, where I had to set the scope, which was to include only processes used for NERC-CIP compliance, because CIP compliance is where the most benefit lies. In order to move forward, I had to make certain assumptions, such as having the right skill sets on the team and having support from leadership. I then created a list of costs, resources, a timeline, with milestones and determine the dependencies within the timeline. This is also where I determined the method I would use to design the internal controls after researching and talking with people at the Western Electric Coordinating Council, or WEC for short. I found they preferred the 5W1H method. 5W1H method is where you identify the who, why, what, where, when, and how in order to define the internal control. Additionally, I took pieces from the methodology defined by the North American Transmission Forum, or NATF, where they identify risk scenarios and fill out an internal control inventory worksheet. Once I had my method defined, I began to review and evaluate the processes within the scope. These processes are used for compliance with SIP2 and SIP3. Because TCP is a fictitious utility, I had to create all new SIP2 and SIP3 processes that a typical utility would follow. Being in the industry, I've seen many of the processes that are used by others to comply with SIP standards. I also had to determine the detailed and functional requirements, which would later play a role as my testing and quality assurance criteria. This brought me to the fun part of the project in Phase 3, where I began executing the methodology and filled out the internal controls identification and design worksheets. This is also where I performed the cost-benefit analysis and risk assessment. And as a result of the cost-benefit analysis, I ended up determining 31 internal controls in total in order to lower the cost-to-internal control ratio. In the end, the project budget was about $83,000. With 31 internal controls, that meant each internal control cost about $2,700 to develop. Now, a $2,700 investment to reduce the risk of a $1 million per day fine is a huge return on investment. Not only that, but the processes are now more efficient and will ensure they're effective. Just a couple of the proposed internal controls from the project was to hold monthly meetings with the SIP senior manager to discuss the state of compliance, and to create a yearly project schedule for all of the tasks that have to be completed throughout the year. The methodology I used for the project was the project management lifecycle, which you can see on the left side of the slide. The strategy for my project is on the right. I chose this approach because it follows a logical progression. It's scalable and it can sustain long-term success. As you can see on the project management lifecycle, phases 1 and 2 of the project management lifecycle, the initiation and planning, were incorporated into phase 1 of my project. The project execution phase, phase 3 of the project management lifecycle, was broken into phases 2 and 3 of my project. Phase 4 of the project management lifecycle, project monitoring, was actually incorporated throughout all of the phases of my project through the use of milestones, a timeline, and the metrics used to measure the completion of each milestone. Lastly, Phase 5 of the project management lifecycle, closure, was incorporated into Phase 3 of my project, and the project ultimately was determined to be completed or closed when the team provided all of the deliverables. When thinking about successes, I first have to mention the support I received from my friends, my family, and team members at work, but most importantly, the support I received from my wife, Veronica, and my 2 sons, Ruben and Elias. There's no way I would have been able to complete this program without their help. Some of the memorable successes along the way for me during the project began when my topic was approved. During the project, I found this was one of the hardest steps because there's just so much out there to tackle in cybersecurity. The next big success came when I completed my prospectus. This was huge because it meant that I was moving forward and starting to see progress regarding my project. That is, until I had to develop the methodology and the process for defining and identifying internal controls, which I'll get to later in the presentation as one of my obstacles. Luckily, I take part in utility industry organizations, and I was able to draw from them on their research. But as I found out, there's not too much in the way of guidance for internal controls. Once I had the methodology and process defined, I was able to begin doing the meat of the project, which was to actually define and identify the internal controls. Completing the worksheets was a huge win because it meant that at that point, all I had left to do was document everything within the report. And this, of course, brings us to the completion of the project where I am now. This has to be the biggest success, since I can now start to reflect on my master's experience and not having to worry about the next assignment or the next assessment. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the biggest obstacle is that there isn't much guidance on internal controls. Even in the WGU program, there was only one book which had a paragraph on internal controls. Even then, it mainly talked about accounting. I couldn't find anything on internal controls within NIST either, which was really surprising. The only meaningful resource on internal controls I could find were the North American Transmission Forum, or NATF, the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, or COSO, and WEC. However, in order to get any information from the NATF, you have to belong to a utility that is a dues-paying member. Luckily, I am. In order to get access to the COSO framework, you have to pay for it. And WEC, well, the website's horrible. Good luck finding anything you need on that website. During the program, I learned a lot of things along the way. Within the cyber law regulations and compliance domain of study, I learned how many of the laws, such as the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the National Stolen Property Act, and Federal Deposit Insurance Act, apply. I also learned that we have a long way to go with these laws, and it's very difficult for them to keep up with technology as technology evolves. I learned how to pick out and implement controls from frameworks such as the NIST 800 series, HIPAA, and the ISO 27000 series. And lastly, I learned how to properly protect intellectual property through the use of patents and copyrights and trademarks. In the leadership and professional domain of study, I feel I learned enough to lead a risk assessment session in order to determine risks, identify the source of the risks, quantify the likelihood of the risk occurring and the impact of the risk, the controllability of the risk, and then moving on to the 4 T's, which is the determination to either transfer, terminate, tolerate, or treat the risk. Regarding professionalism, the Certified Ethical Hacking course taught me about how to use hacking skills and techniques in an ethical manner to find vulnerabilities in order to protect against attacks. In the security planning and management domain of study, this is where I learned about cybersecurity frameworks and methodologies for security, such as defense in depth, the cyber kill chain, and the NIST cybersecurity framework. Where the defense in depth methodology focuses on protecting, detecting, and responding through the use of controls, not internal controls, but controls rather, around people, such as policies, and controls around operations, such as incident response plans, and controls around technology, such as through the use of passwords. However, the cybersecurity framework also deals with identifying your highest risk assets or systems and recovery through the use of disaster recovery plans and backups. Lastly, in the system security domain of study, I learned about more frameworks which were built around identifying vulnerabilities, including the pen testing framework and the hacking lifecycle, in addition to the cyber kill chain. However, this domain of study included more hands-on work with many different tools to understand forensics or perform a vulnerability analysis. This domain of study also included more granular technical details on systems such as virtual private networks, firewalls, and intrusion detection and prevention systems. And this brings us to the application of it all. During the program, I was putting many of the concepts that I was learning into practice as I was learning them. In fact, more than once, I cited some of the textbooks and presentations at work. Many of the things I learned helped me to be more efficient, more effective in my position with NERCSIP compliance in identifying internal controls and participating in risk assessments. After the program, in my new role as the manager of my utilities network operations center, I plan to apply my knowledge gained to continue identifying internal controls, to determine priorities for implementing of controls, either from the NIST or ISO networks or the many others that I've learned throughout the program, and the use of risk assessments and the use of tools to identify vulnerabilities. I value my experience and feel I've grown and gained more tools to help me in my career as I progress. As a result, my organization is just that much more secure. Well, thank you very much for watching my presentation. Again, my name is Ruben Robles, and I appreciate your time.